Hey guys, this is Alternate Timeline Steve with Alternate Timeline CollectorMania with Alternate Timeline Taigam Sidisi's Hand. We're moving on with our Commander Collection series with the next installment of the Commander C17 deck text, essentially. So this guy is really interesting. He is a 5-cost human wizard 3/4. He states skip your draw step, which seems really bad, but actually turns out to be really good. And says at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So pretty interesting ability, great to build around as far as like graveyard strategies. His next activated ability is pay 1 black and then tap him, exile X cards from your graveyard, target creature gets -X until end of turn. So really good at paying down like commanders, huge threats, can get rid of Avacyn's, can get rid of anything that's indestructible, can get rid of basically anything that's not hexproof or shroud. So really interesting commander, and I'm really excited to explain, I guess a deck that I built for him for you guys. Breaking into our creatures here, we've got first up a Merfolk Looter. Of course, we want to put as many cards into our graveyard as we can to basically use the payoff of our deck. Merfolk Looter has always been one of my favorite early draw creatures, essentially, because I mean you're looting, you're doing everything you want to do, you're drawing a card, then discarding a card. So really you can select whatever you want to go in there for later reanimation spells or anything like that. So just a cheap way to get that engine going. And then we've got Kira the Great Glass Spinner. Really good for protecting our commander, since we're not going to end up targeting with any of our spells. There's no pumps in here. There's no real fancy tricks that way. So Kira is a great addition here because it'll protect itself and all of our big threats that we're going to end up reanimating later. Then we've got an Inspired Sprite. This is another one of the creatures that's similar to the Merfolk Looter, except for this one has, if you play a wizard, it untaps and you can do it all again. So if you think about it, turn 4, you play this guy, you tap him before you play your commander, you play your commander, or turn 5, I mean. You tap him, you play your commander, and then you untap him, then you can do it all again. And that just, once again, starts feeding into that engine. So really powerful that way. Plus it's got flash and it's a flyer. So a surprise flash flying blocker is always good. Then we've got a payoff creature for our graveyard, and that's Vizier of Many Faces. So either way we get this card, if we have it in our hand, we play it, we clone something, it dies eventually, then we have it in our graveyard to reanimate later per its own ability. Or we discard it with Taigam's ability, and then we can reanimate it, and then have a whatever creature we want again. So really, really good card for this deck. I think Embalm and Internalize actually work really well with this commander. Then we've got one of my favorite clone effects, and that's Evil Twin. This is by far, like I said, one of my favorites. It's essentially copy something, and then you can pay 2 later on and tap it and destroy the other copy of this creature, their copy of the creature. So say you copy something crazy like a not Nizan or something like that. Now you can kill a Nizan with this guy as long as he doesn't have his hammer. But, so on and so forth. Really cool effect. Really like this clone. We've got another new card, and that's Possessed Scab. Well, not new card. It's from Origins. Possessed Scab. It's probably one that not a lot of people have seen or heard of because it came out in a set that had a lot of really good flashy cards, so this was probably thrown under the radar, but I'll read him for you here. He's a 3/2 zombie for 5, 3 colorless, 1 blue, 1 black. He reads, when Possessed Scab enters the battlefield, return target instant, sorcery, or creature card from your graveyard to your hand. If Possessed Scab would die, exile it instead. But I mean, really, that's pretty good. It can grab you 3 different types of spells from your graveyard and put them to your hand, so it's very versatile that way. Plus, zombies that are possessed by spirits are always cool in my book, I guess. We've got a Body Double, another one of those creatures that have a huge benefit for us putting a bunch of creatures into our graveyard, or even our opponents putting creatures into their graveyard, so nothing but upside there. And then we've got another engine to go along with Taigam, and that's Stitcher Geralf. So this guy not only affects you and puts cards in your graveyard, but puts cards in everybody's graveyard. Then you get to select 2 creature cards from any graveyard and make a token. So that's really powerful for getting rid of like huge threats from, like, say you're playing against like a Carador deck, or you're playing against like a Marin or any of those types of decks. And now you can just start getting rid of the things that you're essentially putting into their graveyard for them, because that's not what we want to do. We don't want to feed the other graveyard decks, we only want to feed ours. So there's that. And then we've got another threat that not a lot of people remember, and that's Rexel the Risen Deep, or Rexiel, or I think it's Rexiel. I remember way back when we had a friend that played this card all the time as their commander, and that was Morgan. It was a pretty spiky deck. It was pretty awesome to watch, and I just, I had to include this as soon as I was going blue-black. So it's got Island Walk and Swamp Walk, which is already pretty evasive. It's a 5/8, and it says, whenever Rexil the Risen Deep deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that card would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. I mean, think of the amount of crazy things that you can just cast from somebody's graveyard. Like, if you need a board wipe, this guy will get it for you. If you need a reanimate spell, this guy will get it for you. So, really good upside, really good target for reanimation. Another one of our big targets is Lord of the Void. This guy's just really good for shutting down a whole bunch of stuff, because if you think about it, he hits somebody, he exiles a bunch of cards off the top of the library, and then you get to essentially play one of them. So, really, really huge threat. 7/7. And I've got our Mac Daddy threat, and that's Inkwell Leviathan. You reanimate this guy, most of the time people aren't going to be able to deal with him. He's got the Island Walk, the Trample, and the Shroud. So he's probably going to be really bad for somebody out there. Even if they don't have islands, he just tramples over. And his butt's so big that usually they're not going to be able to get rid of him very easily. Moving on to our artifacts here. First up, we've got a Thought Vessel. Now, I know we talked about this in the other alternate timeline Taigam deck, but once again, it's just a huge benefit in here, especially since we're going to be drawing a ton of cards through alternative means. So, I mean, keeping our hand is probably, pretty important to us since we'll be discarding so much of it anyway. Yeah, just a really good mono rock. There's nothing wrong with it. It does everything you want it to do. On from that, we've got a Fellwar Stone. So there are a few things in here like Havengal Lich, things like that, that want us to have our enemy's mana, essentially. So with this, we kind of have access to all of that. There are a few other cards that you can put in the deck too that benefits as well. Also, it's just another 2 mana rock. So even if this is tapping for gray mana all the time, it's still a benefit to me. And then we've got a shutdown piece, and that's Mindlock Orb. Really good for shutting down decks that run a million tutors. Really, really good at shutting down ramp. Since we are not in green, this was just a automatic, in my opinion, in a deck like this. Because if you think about it, now that player can't Rampant Growth. Now that player can't Explosive Vegetation. So those people that are trying to get like 20 mana on like turn 5, like as hard as they try, they can't do anything about it until they destroy this. So really powerful piece as far as control goes. And then we've got an odd card here, and this is an Uba Mask. Usually you don't want this type of effect on the board, but since we are playing Taigam, this fits right into what we're trying to do. I will read it for you since it is bizarre. So it's a 4-cost artifact, really interesting artwork. It's from Kamigawa somewhere. So it says, if a player would draw a card, that player removes that card from the game face up instead. So now it's exiled, essentially. Each player may play cards he or she removed from the game with Ubermask this turn. So that means, for example, you shut down a lot of control pieces this way, like counter spells, anything like that. Because now they only have that opportunity to use it, and they're not going to be able to store it in their hand. There are a lot of things like that, say, for example, somebody doesn't have the mana for a huge spell now, and they really need it, like a Decree of Pain or something like that. Now their choices are very limited as far as, well, do I let this exile, or do I waste all my mana casting it right now? So, really interesting control piece. It doesn't affect us really that much because we have Taigam's ability at the beginning of our upkeep instead of drawing a card. So we kind of have a way to get around that a little bit. And then past that, we've got the main key piece with Taigam, because if you get these two together, then you're pretty gold. It costs 8, so it's pretty hard to get out there, but it's an artifact, and it says if a player would draw a card, that player skips that draw instead. At the end of each turn, each player sacrifices permanent unless he or she discards a card from his or her hand. So not only is this feeding into not anybody else being able to draw cards, we can't either at the beginning of their upkeep, but it also feeds into our graveyard strategy where each person's discarding a card, as are we, but we don't really care because that's what we're running our engine off of anyway. Really interesting card. I wouldn't play it in anything but this, but it's an interesting one, that's for sure. So rolling on to our enchantments here, we've got Paradox Haze. Obviously with Taigam having 2 upkeeps is great because we don't have a draw step again. So this essentially lets us draw or look at 6 cards, put 4 in the graveyard, and then put 2 cards in our hand, so that's pretty powerful. Obviously, it can get a little tricky when we're getting close to the end of our library, but we've put effects like Kozilek in here to kind of mitigate that so we don't have to worry about it. So yeah, I highly recommend if you're building this guy to grab Paradox Haze. There's a lot of other uses for this, maybe not so much in this deck, but if you think about like a Loro, things like that, this card is always great in those type of decks. On from that, we've got a bizarre card, and I'm still actually waiting to find my copy of this, but as soon as I get it, I will be putting it in here. So it's a 4-cost enchantment. It is Zur's Weirding. So it says players play with their hands revealed, so that's kind of a downside, but whatever. If a player would draw a card, he or she reveals it instead. Keep in mind, we are not drawing a card. We're not drawing any cards. We're using Taigam's ability. If a player does, then any other player may pay 2 life. If a player does, put that card into its owner's graveyard. So even if we are drawing a card and they want to put it in our graveyard, that's a benefit for us. Otherwise, that player draws a card. So, interesting way to kind of, I guess, mess up our opponent's draws even more, even past the Possess portal. You know, if we don't have that, we have this, so on and so forth. Really interesting enchantment, that's for sure. So our instant use spells are mainly here to stop attackers, control the board. First up, we've got Sudden Spoiling. This is probably one of the best deterrents for anybody to attack you, especially if we've got Zur's Weirding or something out. You can't respond to the spell. Like, it's got split second, you know, unless you're doing more for something like that. So anyway, it says until end of turn, creatures target player controls lose all abilities and have base power, toughness of 0/2. So really good gotcha card, probably one of the original gotcha cards before Cyclonic Rift, Aetherize, or any of those were even probably thought of. This card has been around forever. Really amazing trick. Past that, we've got a Soul Manipulation. This card is essentially doing everything we want it to do. It is countering a creature spell that somebody else is playing. It's returning a creature from our graveyard to our hand, so say our Body Double dies or whatever. You know, it's the versatility here is really key. It's probably one of my favorite counter spells just because of that reason. Plus the artwork is absolutely amazing. It's so cool. It's Grixis to a T essentially. So then we've got an Ancient of Excavation. Really cool card. It's one of the newer cards from the last Commander set. It's got the basic land cycling on it, which is really important. You know, if you're on 2 lands and you just need to find your third to play your Mana Rock or whatever, you can use this to get it. But usually we want to do draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand, then discard a card for each card drawn this way. So it's a way to, I guess, windfall, but windfall like selectively. So that's pretty powerful, especially since it's at instant speed. So there's that. Then we've got one of my favorite cards ever, and that's Wretched Confluence. I know I've talked about this card before, but really highly recommended. The modes on here are amazing. I mean, target player draws a card and loses 1 life. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Return a target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. I mean, that is doing everything you want it to do. It's removal, it's card draw, it's recursion. Yeah, it's everything tied up in one nice little package. Then we've got another new card from the last Commander set, C16, that's Curtain's Call. I've usually found this to be extremely effective. Most of the time you're playing in a 4-player game, so I mean, this is reasonably costed. And then for those odd instances where you're playing like, you know, like a 5-player game, this just gets even better. Now it costs 1. That's pretty good. So there's that. And then we've got to dig through time. So sometimes, you know, especially, well, not so much in this deck, but there are instances where you don't want certain things in your graveyard. So dig through time is not only a really good way to use that fodder in your graveyard, like all those extra lands or whatever, but it's also a way to be very proactive about what cards you're putting into your hand, especially since we're using Taigam's ability. So we're not necessarily going to draw a whole bunch of cards that way. So this is kind of a way to mitigate that and help us get through our library, essentially. So really cool card, highly recommended. So kicking off our sorcery speed spells here, we've got a Torment of Hailfire. So this is not only, like, I don't know, one of the coolest cards to come out of Hour of Devastation, in my opinion, but it's a scalable, ridiculous monster. I mean, if you read it, repeat the following process X times. Each opponent loses 3 life unless that player sacrifices an online permanent or discards a card. So, I mean, early game you pay this for 3, everybody's like, you know, minorly hindered essentially. Late game, you pay like 10 into this. Now everybody has a lot of hard choices they have to start making. Probably somebody's not going to have a hand, you know, something like that, or no one's going to have permanents. It's an interesting card. Yeah, it gives your opponents choice, but I really don't see the downside on this one. The choices are always bad, you know, so there's that. Unless you're playing against tokens, then I guess they can just, yeah, but there's always instances. Past that, we've got a Rise from the Grave. One of the key things here is that we want to be able to reanimate our own spells, but our own creatures from our graveyard, but this has the upside of being able to target other people's graveyards. There are a few spells like this, and I need to find some of the more, I guess, more modern ones. This is kind of an older one. But this card is actually pretty good. It can reanimate, you know, Razakast from somebody else's graveyard or whatever we want. You know, Avengers Zendikar, I've done that several times with this card, so it's definitely a huge upside. And then we've got a Spell Twine. This is another one of my favorite spells just to cast on a empty board, because then all of a sudden you have a huge benefit of casting ridiculous spells from not only your graveyard but somebody else's graveyard. So it reads as exile target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard and target instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard. Copy those cards, cast the copies if able without paying their mana costs. Exile Spell Twine. So I mean, there are a ton of instances where this is just absolutely broken. I mean, I'm sure I could name a few if I, you know, really thought about it, but one of my favorite cards, and there's, yeah, it's awesome. And then we've got one of my new, I mean, it's not a new card, but I've recently discovered it, and that's Necromantic Selection. This is probably one of my new favorite board wipes. Not only does it get rid of everything on the board, but it also reanimates a creature and puts it into play under your control. So that, in a lot of instances, can be really powerful. I mean, if you think about it going back to like Razakast or something like that, or Avengers Zendikar, think about it. You just destroyed the entire board, and now you've put an Avengers Zendikar into play as well. So really powerful, highly recommended for pretty much anything that can run it. So there's that. So last up, as always, we have our lands. First, we got our Mystifying Maze. I know I just talked about Core Haven in the last video. This is the, I guess, alternative version of that. And as you know, as much as I tore it down in the last video, it actually is pretty good. I mean, paying 4 to essentially stop like a Prosh or anything that's going to come and just wipe you out in one turn is really good. So not bad. Good for like, especially if you're like running a lot like Eldrazi spells, stuff like that. It'll tap for that colorless mana for you. The upside again is that it does tap for mana, which not, you know, Maze of Ith doesn't. So there's the upside to having this effect instead. So there's that. And then we've got an Ipnu Rivulet. So this is a desert land from Our Devastation. So you can tap it, add 1 colorless, or you can pay 1 life and add a blue to your mana pool. Yeah, I know. Why would you include this in your deck? But it also has pay 2 and tap it, sacrifice a desert. Target player puts the top 4 cards over his or her library into his or her graveyard. So if you think about the type of deck that we're running, sometimes we just need that 4 cards into our graveyard to kill something with Taigam. Like, say, for example, you're up against, like, the Ur-Dragon, and you need 10 cards in your graveyard to exile them, and you're on 9, you know. Now you can activate this, you know, put it in your graveyard. You can exile this as well, you know, put 4 cards into your graveyard. Now you can be a little bit selective, keep like 3 or 4 cards in your graveyard, and then -X that thing and get rid of it. So there's a pretty good course of play, and I love having effects that are lands that essentially do what spells are supposed to. So the downside on this really isn't that bad. Paying 1 life to get a blue here or there, it's not going to be terrible for you. And then lastly, we've got a Bojuka Bog. As we've talked about, this deck is pretty good about putting cards in your graveyard, but there are a few cards in here that put a lot of cards in other people's graveyards, and sometimes that can be bad for us. Once again, if we're playing against like Carador or Marin or any of those like traditional reanimator decks, we want to have an answer for that, and this is our biggest answer. You know, we can't play Scavenger Ooze, we can't you know, play any of those key ones that we normally can. So Bojuka Bog, it's an oldie but a goodie. So with that, that is our deck tech for Taigam Sidisi's hand in our alternative timeline CollectorMania universe, as we like to call it. So we will look forward to seeing you on the next deck tech, and as always, the deck list will be in the description, and we will see you guys next time. Thank you.